Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's very good to be with you today. Thank you very much for joining us, and you're welcome to this webinar, which today focuses on the theme of motivation. Motivation in particular with teenagers. I'll talk in a little bit more detail shortly about exactly what I'll try and cover in the time we have together today. But first of all, just a couple of technical things to talk through. First of all, you'll find the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you can hear me, can you type yes into the chat box? It seems a few of us can. Maybe you haven't found the chat box yet. It is there on the bottom of the screen, so do feel free to make use of that. If you have questions or comments throughout the session today, my colleague Anya will be keeping an eye on the chat box. Sometimes the comments come rather fast, so I don't always have time to respond to them immediately, but with the help of Anya, I'll make sure that we do today. So, a couple of words of introduction before we get started properly. As I said, my name's Rob. I'm an independent consultant and international teacher trainer. I've over 22 years of teaching experience. I've taught all sorts of ages, all sorts of levels, from 5-year-olds to 75-year-olds. I've particularly enjoyed teaching teenagers over the years. I see teenagers as a great challenge, as I'm sure many of us do. I'm today from a place in Poland, a place called Wrocław, which is in the southwest of Poland, not that far from Prague, not that far from Berlin. On a sunny day, Wrocław looks a bit like this in the city centre. Today, of course, is not sunny. Where we are now, it's winter, the beginning of, and today it's been just above 0, so a fine day to stay indoors. Whereabouts are you from? Could you type into the chat box which country you're joining us from today? Do feel free to join in. If you'd like to let us know where you are today, that will be most interesting. It seems we have a little delay on the system, but I do have ways of knowing where some of you are. As far as I can tell, we have people joining us today from Mexico, from Ukraine, from Serbia, from Brazil, and also from other parts of South America. So wonderful that, courtesy of the wonders of the World Wide Web, we are able to be all together today. So, as I said, the session is going to be on the subject of motivation. And what I'd like to try and do in the time we have together is begin by talking a little bit about what we understand by motivation. What is it? Why is it important? And importantly, the majority of the session is going to be given over to talk about ways in which we might create a motivating learning environment for our students. So, the material will be illustrated with pieces taken from a new course. We're very excited about this. This is Focus, American English edition, and Focus is based on 3 main pillars. The pillars being motivation, memory, and meaning. Of course, there's overlap between all of these, but what I will be focusing on primarily today is the first of those 3 M's. The 3 M's, should I say, the M of motivation. So what is motivation? What is motivation? This is an interesting question because it's not always very easy to define. In the words of this man, I'm sure many of you recognize him, motivation, according to Jeremy Harmer, is a state of mind that provokes us into doing something. He goes on to say that if we want something badly enough, we will act on that desire. Motivation is not something we as teachers can instantly give to our students. It's not like saying, do exercise 7 and be motivated. That's quite ridiculous. But what we can try to do is we can try to create an environment where motivation follows. This feeling that Jeremy talks about, this internal feeling that wants us to do something. I'm sure over the years, many of us have come across classrooms like this. Maybe not in our own classrooms, but certainly this does exist. Classrooms full of teenagers who really don't seem to be interested. The body language gives it all away, doesn't it? So what is so important about motivation? Well, if we look at what a lack of motivation can do, I'm sure we can answer this. A lack of motivation is a serious issue because, first of all, it can cause discipline problems. And I'm sure you could see from the picture there, potential discipline issues about to take off. It causes classroom management problems. We as teachers have to somehow deal with these discipline problems. It has a negative effect on other students who might have felt quite positive until they see what their friends are doing. And you know the saying, bad news travels fast. Negativity often travels faster than positivity. This, of course, makes life difficult for the teacher. We are important. We need to think about how we can make our lives that little bit easier and more straightforward. But importantly and seriously, a lack of motivation can become a permanent thing. It can have a detrimental effect on long-term progress as students decide that they don't like English, they don't like the lessons, they don't like the teacher, they don't want to be there. So how are we going to deal with this? This is what this session today is all about, really. Ideally, trying to deal with the problem before it occurs. I see that there are 4 main areas to attend to here. The first is an area called affect and attitude, and we'll talk more about what I mean by that in just a moment. The second is making sure we're using the right topics with our students. Topics they will be interested in, topics they will identify with. The next is to choose the right kinds of activities. Activities that students will enjoy doing and feel a positive result. And finally, ensuring that we choose the right level of challenge. This is obviously a difficult thing. Our classrooms are full of students who are all different, so how on earth do we try and cope with the differences that exist? Well, let's have a look in a bit more detail at some of these things. And I'd like to begin by thinking about what I'm calling affect and attitude. Traditionally, we've often thought of students as all being rather similar. They dress similarly, they're the similar age, similar appearance, similar hobbies, similar interests, similar attitudes. But of course, this is a mistake. Our students are not all the same. They are all different, just as we are here today. So how can we begin by recognizing this? Well, a very simple thing to do is, first of all, just to get to know the students' names as quickly as possible and use them as often as possible. Now, this is tricky. You know, you have a class of 30, 40 students perhaps, and remembering all their names is never straightforward. But it's an important thing to attempt to do. Something else I attempt to do as often as possible is to memorize just one fact about each student and to refer to it in activities. So for instance, if you just remember one thing about each of your students, so for instance, a student like Robert might be an excellent footballer, or Anna has a sister in Italy, for instance, you can sometimes bring those into activities, and that makes those students feel valued, feel interested. We're demonstrating through doing this that students are indeed individuals. They're not just a homogeneous, faceless group, as the picture we had a moment ago showed. There is one other thing too that can cause motivational problems if we don't get it right, and that is professionalism. We need to be fair, we need to be consistent. As soon as we're seen as not doing this, students can get rather irritated. And worse, they lose respect for us, and as a result, they lose motivation. So if we say we're going to do something, we should stick with it. If we are having games, we should make sure that the rules always are the same for everybody. Topics are another important area. I'd like to share with you at this stage a list of topics. A list of topics that we might use in our classroom. But do you think your students, your teenage students, would be interested in reading about or discussing any of the following? Just in the text chat, indicate what you think by writing generally yes or no. Here are the topics. So 5 topics there. We've got 1 vote for no, 2 votes for no, 3 votes for no so far. The votes for no seem to be increasing by the second. Okay, not all of them. Okay, of course, it's hard to generalize, and there might be a student in your class who for some reason is interested in Renaissance art and literature. I would argue that among teenagers is going to be rather unusual. I would suggest that none of these topics are really very safe topics. First of all, if we ask students to describe what they can see in the classroom, how exciting is that? It's called stating the obvious. We can all see the same things, so what's the point in talking about it? We can modify that one and make it much more interesting. Insofar as if we said to the students, what can you see in the classroom and how could it be better? That becomes personal and therefore much more interesting. The second one, well, they may have something to say about it, but it's not very interesting, is it? I should imagine most teenagers have the same things for dinner, pretty much. So there's no variety there, there's no interest. As we've mentioned, art and literature of the Renaissance period is fascinating to some adults, probably not for teenagers. Likewise, the political situation in the Middle East. And finally, let's be careful about this one. Non-existent people from non-existent places doing non-existent things. I'm talking here about things such as those exercises you might find in course books featuring Peter and Jane, who live in a beautiful town somewhere in the middle of nowhere. These people are not real. They're not from literature. They don't exist. Harry Potter, on the other hand, is something different. Harry Potter's non-existent, but he's a figure from literature, and this is something that might be a suitable area to go with. But as we've got them on the screen, generally speaking, I would suggest that the topics here are not really very, very appropriate. So perhaps we need some better ones. And I've come up with a little quiz here. A quiz based upon topics that we might use with teenagers, topics they might find some sort of interest in. So my quiz is very easy. All I want you to do is choose the letter A, B, C, or D for the multiple choice answer that you think is correct and pop it into the text chat. So here we go. Question number 1 is a sports question, and the question is, which country has the highest ski resort in the world? Is it A, France, B, Bolivia, C, Canada, or D, Italy? And we've got various possibilities coming through. Lots of you think C, a few of you think A, but I haven't yet seen anybody put the right answer in. You might be surprised to know that the correct answer is, in fact, Bolivia. There we are, Bolivia, South America. Okay, question 2. This is a question called, what is couch surfing? Is it A, a sport? Is it B, a chain of furniture stores? Is it C, a network of travelers who offer free accommodation? Or is it an illness? And I think a lot of you know this. Maybe 1 or 2 of you have even used it. It is indeed C. This was set up some time ago, and the idea is that through the website, Potential guests get in contact and they stay for free with other members of the organization. Sounds like a good idea to me. How about the next one? What do Albert Einstein, Barack Obama, Leonardo da Vinci, and Marie Curie all have in common? A, are they all left-handed? B, are they all vegetarian? C, are they all poets, or were they? Or D, are they all colorblind? And the answer is A, all left-handed. There's a lot of folklore about left-handedness around the world. In some countries, you're probably aware that in the past, people who started naturally being left-handed were forced into writing with their right hand, often against their will. So I wonder how many of our students are left-handed. Interesting, isn't it? Here's another one for you. YouTube. And the question here is, what was the title of the first ever YouTube video? A, B, C, or D? Okay. I haven't seen the right answer yet, but thank you for your suggestions. The answer is actually A, Me at the Zoo. A little bit like Facebook, YouTube was started as a bit of fun, as a bit of an experiment, really. And the founder decided it would be a fun thing to do to try and put a video that he'd made at the zoo up onto the internet. And that was the beginning of something that's very big, something that we are all more than familiar with now. I'm sure you'll find all the others on YouTube now as well, but Me at the Zoo was the first. And the final question, question 5. What did James Bond actor Daniel Craig insure for $9.5 million whilst filming The Quantum of Solace, one of the Bond films? A, B, C, or D? Okay, we've got some correct answers coming through here. Most of you have got that. The correct answer is, in fact, C, his body. So there we are. A film star question. Film stars often an area of interest, not just for teenagers, but I think for many of us. So there we go. You might be wondering where I found these topic areas, these real life questions. Many people say the internet, which of course I'm sure could be true. They might be out there, all these pieces of information. But in fact, all of this stuff came from a course book. All came from Focus American Edition. What we've got here is essentially a mild form of CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The idea of learning about the world around us at the same time as developing language skills, but also, importantly, providing a context for language introduction and practice. So you'll find throughout Focus lots of real-world topics, and the ones I've shown you today, there's the one about the ski resort in Bolivia. There is the one that's all about the second question, which I've forgotten what it was. What was the second question? It'll come back to me in a minute. There's the one about left-handedness, and there's Barack Obama writing there with his left hand. The one about technology there, digital firsts and YouTube, and finally the one relating to film stars and James Bond. So lots of real-life topics, lots of things that are not fictitious, lots of things that teenagers will find some sort of interest from. So a few top tips about topics. I think what we need to be doing is to try and inspire students, inspire them with topics that will mean something to them. Make a connection in some way to their everyday life interests. And we're trying to do that with things such as sport, films, technology, and even left-handedness. Intrigue them with surprising things, surprising or interesting facts. And course books nowadays are full of these things. And a principle really here is starting with the known and moving to the new. The known is the topic that they will relate to, and we're using that topic as a springboard into the new. That is, new language, new grammar, new vocabulary, new communication. What about activities? That's another big question, isn't it? What do we do in the classroom? Well, in the classroom of old, we might have had the teacher standing at the front of the room for 30, 40, 50 minutes, piece of chalk in hand, talking non-stop, like I'm doing now, and writing on the board. This was the era commonly known as chalk and talk, and the reaction I'm sure we can all remember if we experienced it ourselves in our own learning situations. Yep, a great opportunity to have a nice sleep. This is not the way forward. The 21st century has shown us now lots of other ways of doing things. And one of those ways is not necessarily writing. Writing is fine. Writing is excellent. We'll talk more about it in a moment. But there's more to the classroom than having children sitting writing individually all the way through the lesson. Far more. First of all, we touched on the area of personalization earlier on. Language is all about achieving results, results that matter to us. Things like maintaining friendships, entertaining one another, solving problems, sharing opinions, sharing information. All of these things are what we do with language in everyday life. So surely this is what we need to be doing in the classroom if we're going to prepare our students successfully for their future. So how can this work in practice? Well, one of the little things I do when I look at practice activities in course books, I apply a little test. It's called the you or your test. And if we look at this one here, it says, choose words and phrases and list them under these headings. Add your own ideas. So the student is involved from the beginning. Here's another example. We make sentences, unscramble the words, and then it says, write sentences that are true for you. So we're not talking about Peter and Jane, we're not talking about fictitious people, we're talking about the students themselves. And here's a further example. Complete the sentences with the correct which, who, that, where, and so on. And tick the sentences that are true for you. I've got another little activity here. This is highly personalized. This is about a real person. It's about me, actually. There are 5 sentences you can see there on the screen. Now then, a little challenge for you. One of those is not true. One of them's a lie. Now, I know we don't know each other. We've probably not met before. So you're going to have to guess. Which one of those do you think is a lie? Just put the number into the text chat. I meant to mention Dire Straits, a famous rock band from the 1970s, 1980s. Mark Knopfler was their lead singer. It seems some of you know that because you've put that one in as the one you think is a lie. Okay, lots of suggestions coming in. Number 5 seems quite popular, doesn't it? How can a teacher own a Rolls Royce? Yeah, interesting question. Okay, this is a point in the classroom where you will have your students' attention. Prediction is a powerful activity, a powerful tool, because as soon as you get students to predict something, you will have their attention when it comes to reading or listening to find out if they were right or not. They're motivated to find out. So I'm sure you are the same, and I'm sure you want to know which one is not true. I'm going to go through them in reverse order, starting with number 5, which is true. Perhaps you'd like to see a picture of my Rolls Royce. Here it is. I didn't tell you how big it was. It's about 7 or 8 centimeters long, and it comes in a box. Yes, it's a toy. I don't have it anymore, very sadly. Number 4 is true. I have spoken in front of 1,300 people at a Pearson conference, actually. It was in Moscow a few years ago. Amazing numbers. Number 3 is true. I have met Mark Knopfler, only briefly. It was after the concert, and we said hello to each other. That was about all. But I think that counts as meeting. Number 2 is true. I have worked as a waiter. I was a student at the time. I wasn't very good at being a waiter, so perhaps that's why I decided to become a teacher. Which means the lie is, number one, I have not visited 62 countries. I've only visited 61. So I made that very difficult. And I suggest if you do this with your own students, that you tell them to make it difficult. They write 5 sentences, one of them should be a lie, and then working together with a partner or partners, they have to try and work out which is not true. I do remember once doing this with a group of students. One of them wrote, "I have been to the planet Mars." That was perhaps a little bit straightforward, wasn't it, as a lie? Nobody's been to the planet Mars as far as I'm aware. So there we go. A little activity then. It works for any grammar structure. You could use it for any vocabulary area as well. And it gets the student personalizing the language. It means something to them. Something else that's going on there is interactivity. That was an interactive activity, in fact, because not only would the students write those sentences, but they would also share them with each other in order to find out which was not true. Interactivity is a powerful tool. Solitary writing is fine for a while, but it's not sustainable for a whole lesson. The other thing I would argue is that collaborative communication activities are not often possible at home. Students are alone at home when it comes to English. So using the classroom for that is a vital thing to do. We're replicating the real world, if you like, by having students working together. And remember, not every lesson is an exam. Not every lesson involves a student sitting in silence. Interactivity, therefore, allows peer support and a nice, safe opportunity to experiment with the language. Focus has thought of that as well. If we have a look at these, I've highlighted at the bottom there an interactive element to these activities. In a way, they're double practice because they've already written, and next they get to speak using the same grammar. So in pairs, ask and answer. The next one there again. In pairs, ask each other questions based on the sentences that the students have just written. And finally, another example. Tick the sentences that are true for you and compare with a partner. So we're using interactivity. The third, when it comes to activities, is variety. They say variety is the spice of life, and who am I to argue? And there are various ways in which we can vary the materials. We've looked at materials so far based upon the pages of the book. But we've not just got the book at our disposal. The internet's out there. The internet has some amazing opportunities. And it's no accident that the internet, according to this survey, is teenagers' #1 way of spending their free time. I think this is interesting because if you look down at the bottom of that chart, things I used to do as a kid, like drawing and painting and other hobbies, playing musical instruments, way down the list nowadays. Things have changed. And students are beginning to expect the internet to be everywhere with them. It's also had quite a profound effect on language as well. In fact, many of you are probably aware of the ABC. It used to be taught to children in schools. Probably still is. A is for apple, B is for banana, C is for cat, D is for dog, and so on. But have you seen the new one? Have a look at this. If you'd like a copy of that, you will find it on Google. Just Google alphabet taught to kids nowadays. There's some great stuff in there, isn't there? And I have to say, I don't understand all of those things, but we have pretty much got an A to Z of technology there. But to be serious for a second, it's interesting, isn't it, how language changes. At one time, if we use the word keyboard, we would automatically associate that with a piano. Nowadays, if we use the word keyboard, we associate it with a computer. In the old days, we might have used the word mouse and thought of a small furry animal. But in addition, nowadays, we refer to a mouse as being the attachment on your computer. So the internet is everywhere, and the internet is no exception when it comes to learning opportunities. You see, we've looked at ways in which we can make our classrooms interactive, but what about online practice? Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of blended learning. This is essentially putting these two elements together. How does it work? Well, Pearson provide course books, they provide audio, they provide video, they provide an e-text for the teacher, all these things that can be used in the classroom. But when it comes to homework, we have still got a traditional paper workbook, or nowadays with something called My English Lab. Very quickly, this is how it works. When the system's set up, and it's quick and easy to do, even I can do it, the teacher has the opportunity to set homework for the students. The students receive their homework, they complete it, and when they're happy that they've done it to the best of their ability, they hit submit. That's when the magic begins, because I'm sure as teachers, none of us are particularly keen on marking homework. Well, it doesn't matter for this, because the system marks it for us. That's the result. On the student's screen, they get a score, they get feedback. You can probably see some of the sentences have turned green, some of them have gone red. Green is a correct answer, red is incorrect. So the students can have another go, and you'll see a clue has popped up there to help them think about what the correct answer should be. So motivation occurs here as they do subsequent submissions and see their score increasing. It doesn't finish there, because obviously teachers, we need to know what's going on. Are they doing their homework in the first place? Well, this shows us exactly that. This is called the grade book, and here are all the class members. It registers how many exercises the students have done. It shows scores, it shows percentages, it shows grades, it even shows color coding. At a glance, we can see exactly what's happening. And one more thing to mention about this actually is a wonderful resource called the Common Error Report. And what this does is provide information as to what the correct answer should have been, what errors were made by the students, how many students made each error, and the names of the students who made the errors. And this is an example of power through knowledge, because what you can do is make quality decisions based on this. If only one student made one of the mistakes, well, perhaps you wouldn't want to spend classroom time remedying it. It would inconvenience all the others. On the other hand, if 25 students all made the same mistake, what's this telling us? You need to spend a bit of classroom time working on it to overcome it. So My English Lab is a complementary resource to go with the course book. So Unit 1 of the course book will have the same topics and grammar and vocabulary as Unit 1 of My English Lab. They're meant to work hand in hand. One other thing to mention here is that a lot of students over the years have come up with very creative excuses for not doing homework. Things like, I left it on the bus, or the dog ate it. I'm sure they'll come up with creative excuses for not using My English Lab, but they're going to have to think hard, because you cannot leave the internet on the bus, and the dog cannot eat your computer. So, food for thought there. And a little bit of feedback from students. And I think you'll see these students from Greece who were surveyed about My English Lab were largely extremely positive. If we look at the top right, with My English Lab and how to type faster on my PC. So more than just learning English, practicing life skills at the same time. Bottom left, it's nice because computers follow us everywhere, so why not use them for learning? And middle on the right, very honest, it has too many exercises. Well, perhaps we can turn that round into a positive thing from the teacher's point of view. How can you have too many exercises in a resource? So that's a little look at My English Lab, a little look at variety. We can continue, though, looking at variety in terms of resources by thinking about video. Now, in my experience, and I'm sure in yours too, when you tell your students that they're going to watch a video, the response is usually very enthusiastic. They think, oh, brilliant. We're not going to do any work today. We're going to watch TV. That's fantastic. Well, of course they are doing some work. They just don't see it that way because they see video as being closely related to something they do in their own free time for pleasure. There's a strong association. So where does video fit in with focus? Let's have a look, shall we? If we go to this part here, this is a speaking activity. The students are asked to plan a day out in Toronto. They're given some information. There it is, all about possible things to do in Toronto. But I'm sure you'll agree that if we just say to the students, okay, now speak, not a lot will happen. We need something more structured, and that is provided. It's provided, first of all, in the form of listening. So they're given a model. Two young American students visiting London, trying to decide where to go based upon the plan you can see on the screen there. They're also given useful language. This is a very important element of the process, ensuring the students have the language to express themselves. And you will notice here it's presented as a box, but there is an activity to go with it. In the past, there would be a box on the screen that would just, in the student book that just said, use these expressions, and students very rarely did. With this, they interact with the material because they have to listen and underline the phrases that they hear. And in so doing, the material becomes more memorable. So where does video fit in? Well, it does, because we don't just have the opportunity for the students to listen to the model conversation, they have the opportunity to actually see it live. Now, I'm not going to play the video. The webinar system here is not always very receptive to video, but just a little shot from the video. There are two teenagers, and they're discussing what they're going to do in London. There are subtitles. There are subtitles you can switch on and off here, which helps students who might struggle with just listening. But we don't stop there, because we also have something known as interactivity. How does that work? Well, basically, what we get is additional video material where just one of the characters speaks, and the students have to take the part of the other person in the dialogue. So they all speak along together. It's an excellent way of reinforcing the language, and it's also an excellent way of building confidence and helping pronunciation. And we can go the other way as well. We have the other character from the conversation here, and the students provide the other half of the dialogue, so they get to practice both halves of it. Multimedia is a powerful thing. It's an excellent way of supplementing the listening in receptive skills development. There's a degree of realism with it, realism in various ways. You see, when we speak or when we listen, we often see the other person involved. Okay, that's not the case in exams or when we're on the phone, but an awful lot of the time, and increasingly so on the internet nowadays. As you can see me today, seeing the person who's speaking is realistic. Realism from another aspect comes from exposure to natural English. Students like this. English is changing all the time. And if we'd heard those two people speaking, you would have heard them beginning their dialogue with, "Hey guys, hey guys." Now, some of us might cringe at that. In the old days, it would be "Good morning, everybody." But "hey guys" is real. That is the way people really, really speak. So the audio material we find nowadays has much more variety than it ever did before in terms of different accents and different ways of communicating and pronouncing things. It's excellent modeling for productive skills, which of course is what the students would go on to do next in our sequence that we've just looked at. And the visual channel, of course, is not only natural, but it's also a powerful tool to help students understand what's going on. And as a result, video is a valuable tool for mixed ability classes. I have a question for you at this stage, actually. Does anybody here teach a class that is not mixed ability? Anybody here teach a class that is not mixed ability? Nope. Elżbieta. Thank you. Anybody else joining in? Okay, Rebecca, thank you. And Sanya and Fabian. Yeah, the answers are coming in. It was a ridiculous question, wasn't it, really? We touched on this earlier on, in fact. There is no such thing as a class that is not mixed ability. Every class has differences. You put two people together, there'll be a lot of differences. Put 30 together, there are even more. So our challenge as teachers is to try somehow to find the right level of challenge. And this does have a strong link to motivation. Our classrooms consist of a rich mix of students. We often refer to this as mixed abilities. We have those who are demotivated because they say it's too difficult. We have those who are demotivated because they say it's too easy. And that is a problem too. So how do we provide for the right level of challenge? Well, with focus through a few ways. One way is through recycling. Now, recycling is vital for everybody, but allowing weaker students to catch up is one way in which recycling is a very useful thing to include in our teaching. How does it work in practice? Well, what you'll find at the beginning of the vocabulary sections in the course book are these boxes called Show What You Know. And there are several things going on here. First of all, we are basically getting the students to activate schemata. The topic in this case is going to be about houses and no, it's not. It's about free time activities. My apologies, free time activities. So if the students know that's what we're going to talk about, well, give them a chance to think of words that are related to it. Bring them to the front of the brain. They do this interactively. And the thinking behind this is that we try to get the students from a roughly common starting point. There is also material in the workbook which does a similar thing. The first couple of activities in the vocabulary pages of the workbook are things that you could set for homework before the lesson, in this case on free time activities, and give them chance at home to get the language into their minds and bring it to the front, ready for the lesson where we take that language and develop it. So two ways, one with the course book, one with the workbook, in which Focus American Edition aims to provide for valuable recycling in preparation for a lesson and to attempt to get students roughly at the same starting point. Another one is to provide differing levels of challenge within the exercises. I'm sure we've all heard the eternal cry where you set an activity for students and after a few seconds, one or two of them shout, "Finish!" It's always finish and never finished. Well, how can we cope with that? The workbook has multi-level grammar exercises. So we could start all the class on a 1-star exercise. That's the one with the lowest level of challenge. When you hear the cry of finish, those students can be given a 2-star exercise, which is that little bit more challenging. And then when the next round of finishes resonate around the classroom, you can offer a 3-star exercise. So what's happening here is that students essentially find their own level within the practice material. That way, they're all kept engaged and they are all working at a level of difficulty that's appropriate to them. There is another area too I'd like to mention here, and that is the area of reading. Now, for many students, reading is quite a stressful activity in a foreign language. Confronted with a huge text, they find it quite daunting that they're meant to make something of it. So here's an example of text from Focus American Edition. It's all about a true story, a true scenario, in fact, about fathers who stay at home and mothers who go out to work. So a reversal of the traditional situation that we've had over the years. So how do we help students make sense of the text? Well, there are several ways. First of all, there is an audio track for a lot of the reading texts in the course. And that way, what we're doing, we're providing for multiple channels, not just the visual, but also the auditory. And it's up to you as a teacher to decide whether you want to use one or the other or both. There is flexibility there. Something else I often do with students who struggle with long texts is I tell them to follow the text with their finger. They often say that this is a bit of a babyish thing to do, but I don't see it that way. One of the problems with the big text is that you can be distracted by parts of it that are not important at this very moment. So, by following with the finger focuses the eyes upon the part of the text that's relevant and important at any given moment. And finally, in Focus, you'll notice in the text there are highlighted words, highlighted in colour, in this case in blue, and this is also a help for learners insofar as the keywords stand out. So, a variety of ways in which we've tried to help students with various different aspects of motivation. So we've talked a little bit about the first of the three, M's, motivation. Let me mention at this stage that coming up next week at the same time, Vaughan Jones, who is one of the authors of the course, will be presenting a webinar on memory. In 2 weeks' time, Sue, I should know her surname and I've just simply forgotten it, but it'll come back. Sue Kay, I do apologise. Sue Kay, if you're listening, Sue, I'm very sorry. Sue Kay will be presenting the webinar in 2 weeks' time on the theme of meaning. And then in 3 weeks' time, we must be getting close to Christmas then, I think. In 3 weeks' time, Magda Shevchik will be presenting a webinar based around Focus on teaching tricks. So do register for those. It will be great to have you along for that. I will mention also at this stage that there is about to be a website launched for the American English edition of Focus. Anna, I think, is about to type it into the chat. It will be live in a couple of days, and on the site you will find a lot more information and useful tips about the course. There it is, pearsonelt.com/focus/American. So, I will accept questions in a moment, but let's just sum up what we've talked about in the session. I've tried to suggest 4 ways in which we can foster motivation in our learners. We started by talking about affect and attitude. In other words, the way we relate to students as individuals and not as a homogeneous mass. The second was about topics, choosing topics that students will identify with, that they will find thought-provoking, that have a connection in some way with their lives. The third was to choose activities. Activities that are personalized, bearing in mind that language is for personal purposes, and interactive, making the most of the classroom as an arena in which to practice language communicatively. And finally, we talked briefly about trying to provide the right level of challenge. So, to finish off, I'd like to share with you a couple of quotes. I particularly like this one from Dwight Eisenhower. Motivation is the art of getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. I think that's wonderful. Just the use of a couple of pronouns there, to me, says it all. And from Zig Ziglar, a well-known quote on motivation. It says, "Of course, motivation is not permanent, but then neither is bathing. But it is something we should aim for, let's say, on a regular basis." So, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Bear in mind that the website address on that final slide is not quite correct. It should have /American after the address that's given. But at this stage, we have a few minutes spare. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And the first questions come straight away. How do I motivate a student who doesn't want to be motivated at all? Well, my answer to that, I have to say, is one or two of the things that I've mentioned in the last 50 minutes. I have to be honest with you, I've never come across a student who will never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, be motivated. I think it takes time, it takes experimentation, it takes all sorts of tricks. I honestly think that it is possible, and I've worked with some very tough students over the years. Experiment with one or two things I've mentioned. That's all I can suggest at this stage to give you a quick answer. Any other questions? Where to find challenging topics? Dare I say it? Focus, American edition. No, seriously, I have to say, those 5 topics I shared with you earlier on in the quiz, as a grown adult, I was quite fascinated by them because they came from a book that was aimed at teenagers. I thought that was quite fascinating, really, that these books are so full of these things. And I've reached the stage now where if a new course book comes along, the first thing I do is I read all the texts. And the things I've learned, you know, it's wonderful. Beautiful voice, Rob. Thank you very much. I don't know what to say to that one. That's very kind of you. You're motivated too. Thank you. Well, all I can say is try out some of the ideas I've mentioned. I can't say that I can wave a magic wand and that everything will always be perfect. You know, when you're dealing with teaching, when you're dealing with human relations, there are always challenges, there are always obstacles along the way. It's not easy, but as I say, try out 2 or 3 of the things I've mentioned.